Okay, we're going to use a number line first as we have previously, but it's unscaled, which means it's not going to match a scale perfectly. We're just using the idea of the number line as to work out what's happening with the numbers. So I put out a number line and I know I'm starting at 0.5 and I don't scale anything else. So I'm at 0.5, I'm going to move to the right by 1 whole and then 0.07 or 7/100ths. Do it in parts. So first I'm going to move by 1 whole. So if I'm at 0.5 and I move 1, I'm going to be at 1.5. And then I think about, okay, well now I want to add on 0.07. So I could simply mark it on and I would be at 1.57 if you're comfortable with that. If not, you may have decided to mark in from 1.5 to 1.6 and marked in the 10, 3, 4. You might have chosen to mark in the hundredths like that. So an unscaled number line, you can see this scale doesn't make sense when you compare it to everything else. We're not worrying about that, we're just using it as a tool to move in parts in our mind, and eventually we might not even draw the number line, we might picture it. So that's what the unscaled number line's for. Certainly not for beginners, but once you've used a number line a few times and you've got some more difficult numbers to work with, it can be really handy. Okay, let's have a look at our algorithm. Oh, and I didn't say our answer is where we finished. So we're looking for 1.57 from all three methods. Lining up our algorithm, we don't do this. We don't put the 5 and the 7 and then suddenly have our decimals in different places and not lined up. Because if we do that, we start adding 7/100ths with 5/10ths, which I don't know what that is. So that's a definite no-no. We line up our decimal places, always our place values. 0.5, 1.07. If you're uncomfortable leaving it like that, you may choose to add what's called a trailing 0, which means we put a 0 in that place. Makes it easier to work with visually, but it doesn't change the value of the number. Okay, let's do some adding. The addition now is quite straightforward. 0 and 7 is 7 in the hundredths place. 5 and 0 is 5 in the tenths place, and 1 in the ones place. So we've again got the 1.57. That is looking really good. Okay, now to the fractions. A couple of ways to go here. I'll show you the way that I like to do it the best, and then I'll show you a second way if you're not comfortable with my preference, because everyone's a bit different. I'm going to start with 0.5 plus 1.07. And I know I want the same denominators. I know that's where I have to get to. So why not write these numbers with the same denominators straight away? Now to do that, this number here on the right is some hundredths, 107 hundredths in fact. So I want to write this number as hundredths as well, which means I need to take that trailing 0 and put it down here as well, so that I can read hundredths, hundredths. So my two numbers, 0.5 is actually the same as 50 hundredths. That makes sense, they're both worth a half. 1.07 is equal to 107 hundredths. My denominators are the same, I can add them up straight away. 50 hundredths plus 107 hundredths is 157 hundredths. I know that 1 whole could be formed by the 100 hundredths, or I could think about having 157, if that's the hundredths, that's the tenths, that's my decimal place there. So that's my preference. Other people will find that they don't prefer to do it that way. You may choose to rewrite 0.5 as 5/10ths and 1.07 as as perhaps 1 whole and 7 hundredths. So there's a few ways to write these numbers, and that's how numbers work. Lots of different ways. You rewrite them in the form that works for what you're doing. Now we've got to add these two together. So I've got 5 tenths plus 1 and 7 hundredths. I need to rewrite the one on the left, so I've got common denominators. I can multiply this one by 10 tenths or 1 whole, and without changing its value, I'll have 50 hundredths. And I've still got 1 whole and 7 hundredths over here. So altogether I have 1 whole and 57 hundredths. And that's still 1.57. To me this takes more work because you've got to convert 0.5 into fraction form and then again into a second fraction form with a common denominator. So if you can recognize up early how to write a number with a trailing 0 in hundredths rather than tenths, you're going to save yourself a few steps later on. But it's up to you to think about what works best for you. Any of these ways still give us 1.57 as our answer. We're looking really good.